All right. Well, I think, is everybody ready? We can get started. So, all right. Well, I'll kick us off, and then I'm going to disappear very briefly. My name is Matthew Gabriel. I am the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture here at Virginia Tech, and along with the Center for the Humanities at Virginia Tech, we are co-sponsoring this event. My job is very simple. Again, I will just be introducing our panelists, and then I will be fading into the background and just enjoying the conversation. For those of you who are watching, you are welcome to ask questions, and we hope you will indeed ask questions. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can put your questions in there at any time. There's going to be a conversation for a little while, and then we'll get to the audience questions towards the end, and we hope it'll be again kind of a participatory conversation as we kind of move along. So first, I'll introduce our host and our moderator as Professor Sylvester Johnson. Professor Johnson is a professor of religion and culture here at Virginia Tech. He's also the director for the Center for the Humanities. He's also the director of a new program at Virginia Tech called Tech for Humanity, merging both STEM fields and traditional humanistic disciplines. We are also very pleased to be joined by Charlie McCrary. Charlie is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University, and he's working on a project called Beyond Secularization, Religion, Science, and Technology in Public Life. He's also the author of a book entitled Sincerely Held, American Secularism and Its Believers, which is coming out just this spring with the University of Chicago Press. And then last but certainly not least is our other fellow panelist, Ruth Graham. Ruth is a national correspondent covering religion, faith, and values for the New York Times, where she's covered power struggles in the Southern Baptist Convention, Catholic debates over the Eucharist, and turmoil in the Christian prophecy community after the 2020 election. She was previously a writer and reporter at Slate, and she resides currently in Dallas. So again, I will fade into the background. I will turn it over to Sylvester. And if you are watching at home, and I hope you are, please just put your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them later. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thanks to Charlie and Ruth for your agreeing to join us this evening to shed light on a very important topic conversation that a lot of people are, I think, eager to engage with. And so I'd love to just dive right in and start with you, Ruth, and wonder if you, because you've covered issues in religion and politics for several years now, I was wondering if you might talk with us about how these current debates over religious freedom and vaccine requirements both resemble and differ from what we've seen in previous debates about religion and public policy.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And this is just like, it's such a rich topic. So I'm excited to get to talk about it more and sort of think it through a little more. Yeah, in some ways, this is like just the latest in a very long story. Even vaccines specifically have been something that the government has wanted to mandate in certain spaces, but has also realized it's just a no-go for some religious people. So historically, that would have been, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, and some, really smaller sects. So when there's vaccine mandates for school, historically, in schools, there would be exemptions. And the idea is that it would be these small groups. What's different now is that, first of all, just the size of the resistance, the scope of the resistance, and it's generally not people situating themselves in a religious tradition that's known for any kind of objections to vaccines. Actually, Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists have both really softened their stances on this. I think that Christian Scientists say, like, well, we're not dogmatic about it. Jehovah's Witnesses, it's been a long time now, but it's, have really softened their stances. So the objection now, the resistance is happening completely separate from what the government initially imagined when they, set up some of these carve-outs for religious exemptions. So it's happening apart really from what, and, religion reporters like me have thought of as like traditional, and scholars like you all have thought of as religious leadership. There are some Catholic bishops who have weighed in on this, with skepticism to the vaccines and cautions about it, and certainly opposition to some mandates. There are some evangelical voices and some pastors, although it's not the big ones. It's not the people, I'm so sorry. It's not the people who reporters usually call up to kind of speak for conservative white evangelicals. So I mention this all the time, but I'm fascinated by it. Franklin Graham and Robert Jeffress, probably the two biggest white evangelical Trump supporters, have both come out, quite full-throated support of the vaccine. Robert Jeffress has hosted a vaccine clinic at his church here in Dallas. So it's really scrambled the lines of religious authority and who's listening to whom, and, sort of who the government should, has in mind when they're thinking about mandates, and who's taking advantage of those mandates. So a lot of those lines are scrambled in this conversation in a way that is not brand new, but it does feel like we're kind of that it's certainly not going to retract after that this sort of feels like we're on the cusp of a sort of a long-term scrambling of those lines.
And Charlie, over the past year, we've seen numerous instances of public conflict over COVID-19 vaccines and related public health advocacy. So I'm wondering if you could explain how you view some of the challenges that characterize even the idea of religious exemption, and particularly given some of the public manifestations that we've seen recently.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me as well. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. There's a few things to say about this. One is kind of just to back up a few steps. What's really at stake here with the religious exemptions is an interpretation of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution, which has been interpreted quite broadly in recent years. I think it, with some exceptions, the scope of what counts as the free exercise of religion and who gets to count is kind of expanded. For the most part, it's for the last 100 years or so, especially since 1940. So, and especially in the last 5 to 10, many, like Ruth was saying, some of the larger religious organizations, the people that are not typically the defendants or the plaintiffs in these cases, people like Jehovah's Witnesses. Like if you look at any of the cases from the mid 20th century, it's a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, Old Order Amish, small sects, right? Now, in the last, especially since Hobby Lobby in 2014, but even before that, it's been large white evangelical organizations or just individuals who have some sort of Christian conservative identification, which could be Catholic or evangelical. The Catholics are prominent here too. So that's one of the changes that I think we've seen is just free exercise law wasn't, this set of people wasn't trying to use it until the last 10-ish year, really the last 20 or so, but especially in the last few. So that's one big issue. Specifically with COVID, there have been two things. So we're talking about the vaccines today, but also the issue of mass gatherings. Last year, especially like restrictions on how many people you can have in a place. If it's 25 or 50, are we in the orange zone or the red zone? Right, there are all those different restrictions. And so there were a number of churches and religious organizations that contested that, saying that that was limiting their free exercise of religion. I can't practice my religion because part of my religion is to go to a church or a synagogue or whatever with more than 25 people or 10 people or whatever it might be, right? So it's come up in those two instances. One of the reasons it's especially tricky, some of the challenges with religious exemption, specifically with COVID, is the issue of what legal scholars call third-party harms. And this is where to exercise your religion or to get some sort of an accommodation or exemption, might harm somebody else, right? So it's one thing if, we look at a lot of the kind of classic free exercise cases, the Yoder case from 72, where an Amish student didn't basically couldn't go to school until age 16 because he had religious obligations. So the state says, well, we'd really like for you to go to school until you're 16. That's the law, but you can be exempt from it. Doesn't really hurt anybody. If you want to grow a beard in prison, then the prison says, no, you can't grow a beard. You say, well, it's part of my religion, whatever, it's fine. It doesn't hurt anybody. Not getting vaccinated or hosting a super spreader event on a weekly basis harms other people, right? There's a pretty stark example of a third party harm. So this is one of the things that the courts and legal scholars have been trying to wrangle with for the last few years is what happens when exercising your religion infringes on somebody else's rights. Think about like anti-LGBTQ discrimination or something like that. What happens when you exercising your religion hurts other people? And in this case, like could kill them, right? So that I think that's the most acute kind of new issue here.
And thanks very much, Charlie. You also mentioned earlier a Hobby Lobby case. And so I was wondering if you just might quickly explain that for our listeners in case some are not remembering it or just not aware of the importance of that legal precedent.
Sure, yeah. The very brief version of the Hobby Lobby case. So this is in 2014. Hobby Lobby, as a closely held corporation, one of the reasons it made news and was so important is because building on the Citizens United decision from 2010, where corporations got free speech rights. The idea was, well, if corporations as persons have First Amendment rights, do they also have freedom of religion? Answer, yes. So, but what they wanted to do was get an exemption from the Affordable Care Act's mandate that all employers make available all these different types of contraceptives. So there were 4 types. I think there were 20 that were required, and they said we got an issue with these 4 because they thought that they were abortifacient. Now, there's a scientific question here: are they actually abortifacient? What does that mean? And so a lot of medical professionals said these pills don't actually do what you think that they do, but it doesn't really matter because it's their sincerely held religious belief that it was tantamount to abortion, which for them equals murder, right? So they said, we don't want to participate in this. We don't want to make these types of contraceptives available to our employees. And to make a long story short, they won at the Supreme Court. So that set a number of important precedents, but really, I think even more so than that, brought it to the public's attention and helped a lot of conservative Christians kind of rally behind the cause of religious liberty and see what you could do with that as a tool to exempt yourself from secular law, even when it harms other people, in this case, by denying them healthcare, right?
And the person here, of course, being a corporation that had the exercise right, of religion. Yeah. So Ruth, you've written about a number of issues and cases related to the religious exemption and public health issues. And one of those recent articles you wrote was about someone named Daniel Darling, an evangelical leader who became the target of pretty fierce criticism after encouraging people to get vaccinated. I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the case and explain what it reveals about religious sectarianism today.
Sure. So Dan was, until recently, the communications head for National Religious Broadcasters, which is a conservative group, national group, and basically like a lobbying group for Christian radio, TV, other media folks. And they're a pretty big tent. They're conservative, but they mean to really sort of capture anyone who's in Christian media. So Dan was in communications, but he was also, is also something of a sort of public voice himself, public figure. So he's written a number of books, he writes op-eds. And, you know, it's interesting. Dan is like the most like ironic person that you'll ever meet. I mean, he wrote an entire book about online civility. There's problems. There's problems on the left, there's problems on the right. Like he's just like a true blue, conservative evangelical in a very kind of like gentle mode. And so at the beginning of the year, or even last fall, the vaccine was on the way. And as he tells it, he had every reason to think that his employer would be on board with vaccination. Like he was very excited about it. He says he had, excited conversations about it at work. The vaccine was developed under President Trump. It was going to enable national religious broadcasters to hold their really big annual convention again. And his boss even sent out an email to, to the mailing list to that effect, like, hey, we're so excited about this vaccine because it will enable us to meet safely again. And, again, as I talked about a little bit before, and Charlie also hit on, there's really no history within, Dan's Southern Baptist of like serious resistance to vaccines in Southern Baptist history. It's not at all a core part of that faith. So then over the course of the year, of course, things change. And Dan is still pro-vaccine, and he wrote an op-ed for USA Today in August, just sort of walking through why, as a Christian, he was proud to get the vaccine. And it was very, empathetic to people who didn't want it. He really spelled out, like, I can understand why you'd be concerned, why you might resist it, but here's why I did it. What is the quote? There's not many things in the world today that are worthy of our trust, but I sincerely believe the COVID-19 vaccine is one of them. As a Christian and an American, I was proud to get it. That's the crux of the op-ed. And not too much happened, I think, publicly. It wasn't like some huge controversy online or anything, but internally, some of his coworkers were bothered by it. His byline included the fact that he works for NRB. So even though he wasn't speaking for them, there was this impression that the organization, that this was their stance. And so his boss told him informally, what he perceived it as informally, like it was in a Slack chat or something. From now on, the organization will be neutral on the vaccine. So Dan then goes on Morning Joe to talk about the op-ed, and that's when all hell breaks loose. And he was fired pretty abruptly. Describes it as a really bewildering experience. Again, someone who has sort of spent his career, and also you can just feel it in him, like he is an evangelical, and to find himself kind of cast out by an evangelical organization over something that he saw as flowing from his faith, I think was really bewildering. So it's not a legal case. I mean, I actually think for religious reasons, I don't know if he would have a legal case, period. But I think that he would not sue a fellow Christian. I shouldn't, I don't want to state that too firmly, but that's my understanding of how, because other things like that have come up in the news since then, and he's been sort of against Christians suing fellow Christians. So, but it was just really interesting, that specific situation is rare. There aren't too many cases or situations I'm aware of where someone has been fired just for speaking up positively about the vaccine, but it shows, it's an extreme example of how those cultural lines have shifted so quickly within that community. So it was really fascinating to me, and to see how kind of the lines, the reaction lines, you could also see just sort of fall out after his firing became public in the fall.
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating and troubling, but also I think telling case of the scale of tensions and conflicts over these public health issues, and the way this is manifesting as a type of religious phenomenon, as one that has become a rallying call among some religious groups or individuals and communities to talk about what their faith means in these times. So I just have a follow-up, because what that particular case demonstrates, of course, is that there's no such thing as a Christian consensus on this, or an evangelical consensus. Here's an evangelical Christian who is, among others, who are advocating the use of vaccines. You just gave us examples of much more popular evangelical leaders who came out in support of the vaccines. But there's also a sense that there has to be some kind of religious boundaries, or this is a breach of religious boundaries due to these faith traditions. As you are reporting on these issues and looking at different developments that are happening, do you notice any pattern in the way people are perceiving this to map onto particular religious groups or religious communities? Or is there more perception that it really is more random in terms of how people coalesce around the issues?
I wouldn't say it's random. I mean, within evangelicalism, just because that's what we were just talking to, and this is true within Catholicism too. I mean, it maps sort of along the Trump lines, I guess you would say. So there's kind of the populist versus sort of cosmopolitan Christians. That's one sociologist's way of dividing it. That's not my term, but so I think those are loosely the lines. But again, I'm really struck. I've interviewed so many pastors over this last year who are confounded by what they're seeing in their own pews. So, they are vaccinated and are pro-vaccine and are seeing a lot of resistance in their own congregations. A lot of them in white churches, historically white churches, they're not all white, but I think are really exhausted at that. The pandemic has been very, very hard on them because every decision they're making is fraught and everybody's mad about it. When do we start to meet again? When, do we hold off? Do we not? Do we require masking? What kind of, do we encourage masking or not? All of this stuff. And so it's interesting, historically Black churches where there's also quite a bit, starting out was quite a bit of hesitancy toward the vaccine for a very different set of reasons. A lot of those pastors have been willing to host panel discussions, state very squarely that they're for the vaccine, explain, bring in public health officials, host clinics. And that's for a number of different reasons. I mean, there's more of a tradition of talking directly about politics and kind of bringing in, community people to talk about that kind of thing. There's a whole host of reasons for that. But the white churches have, at least as far as my reporting can tell, have been just a lot more hesitant to sort of dip their toe in, even when the pastors will tell me privately or on the record, but just don't want to say it sort of from the pulpit, that they're really confounded and confused by the level of resistance they're seeing. So I think there's no way to name one source that's coming from. It's folks reading stuff online. It's conservative media that's not necessarily Christian media. It's also the really media savvy kind of, people who might be pastors, but who primarily are sort of practicing that in an online space. So a lot of these guys who are really big names online, if you go to their churches, there's, 50 people there in the room, but they have big online audiences. And I think, not to impute motives into some of those figures, but, there's a number of them who I think it's fair to guess kind of see an opportunity here. And who knows the level of sincerity, but it's people who didn't necessarily start out the pandemic as big names, but who have turned themselves into big names by capitalizing on this swirling set of, anxieties and fears and resistance to the Biden administration and distrust of public health, distrust of all these different institutions. Like it's all swirling. And you have some kind of like upstart, more kind of media religious figures who have really stepped into that void and are willing to say the things that, Robert Jeffress, who has a big church in downtown Dallas, is, I don't know if he's not in a position to do that, but is, I don't actually know which way that goes because he's vaccinated. And so I don't know, but it's sort of a whole new set of authorities stepping into that space.
Interesting.
Can I ask a kind of follow up to? Yeah, I'm curious. It's related, I think. I've noticed at least. So I kind of follow some of these conservative Christian legal organizations.
Yeah.
especially like Liberty Counsel and the Alliance Defending Freedom, which have taken different strategies. I mean, I think Liberty Counsel is a little bit further right or a little bit fringier, but I mean, I say fringy, but like they win court cases all the time, so not really. But they, you know, whenever they talk about the vaccine, they say vaccination in scare quotes, and they have like anti-vaxxers on their podcast all the time. Like they spread vaccine disinformation. Whereas ADF, always in their press releases, they say we have no official stance on the vaccine, right? They're not anti-vax, but they're not pro either. And so they actually, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, ADF filed a couple of lawsuits against the OSHA requirements on behalf of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and then the other one on behalf of the Daily Wire, the right-wing content generator that Ben Shapiro runs. And in both cases, both of those organizations, you know, Shapiro was on Fox News on some show the other day, and he made it a point to say, I'm vaccinated, I think vaccination is great, but what's wrong is the requirement, the mandate, the government overreach, right? And so I'm kind of wondering if, you know, among say Southern Baptists or other religious groups, like that kind of a theopolitical argument about government overreach and the dangers of, like, that's a lane that they're a lot more comfortable in. So they don't have to be anti-vax, but they can be anti-Biden and anti-big government, you know?
I think that the mandate has actually been such a gift to some people in those spaces, because it lets them kind of demonstrate their like anti-vaccine, like they can kind of be in the anti-vaccine space, which is where the people are, you know, which is where their base is, without actually being anti-vaccine themselves. So I think that, I think that's been like a real gift to them, just allowing them to kind of position themselves and turn it into a more straightforward and religious liberty sort of conversation, like one that has a little bit more precedent than saying like all of a sudden we are like opposed to the vaccines. Well, no, we're opposed to sort of being forced to take them. I have that same sense of Liberty Counsel, and I won't share those stories here, but I think your sense is correct. Yeah.
So I'd like to ask both of you a follow-up about this, and it's a very difficult question, so I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but you referred earlier in your response to some of these points by recognizing that vaccines are not new. There's a long history of vaccination, and vaccine requirements are not new. If you want your kid to go to school in the United States, America, you know, they're going to have to be vaccinated. And we did maybe a couple of years before the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, we were seeing some religious opposition to vaccination requirements in New York, for example, for the measles vaccine. And this is particularly among Jewish communities. And so that was one thing that we saw, but it was more recent. But for the most part, vaccine requirements have been in place, maybe a different context, maybe it was because it was school-age kids, but does either of you have a sense of, and again, this is a very difficult question, but do you have a sense of why now, why the opposition to policy mandates for vaccination with this particular vaccine, COVID-19, when vaccine requirements have been in place for decades? And the big example is school-age children.
I think it's, I'll take a stab at it. I don't have like a neat and tidy exact answer to that. But yeah, it's absolutely, I mean, I'm fascinated by, I did some reporting, I think it was in 2015, I did a freelance story about resistance to vaccines among conservative Christians who had concerns about there's this remote connection to abortion where some fetal cell lines drawn from a very small number of abortions in the 60s and 70s were involved in the testing and development phase of some of the COVID vaccines. And those same cell lines were used to develop like MMR vaccines. There's I think several others, vaccines in much longer use, and other medicine too. So it's, and I, I pitched this story. I had seen it kind of bubbling up and I was interested in it. And then I remember starting to report it and being like, am I even going to find enough people who are really tuned into this? Like it suddenly felt so fringe to me. And it was not, I mean, I think it was, worthwhile. And obviously it turned into a bigger thing. And it was interesting to talk to them, but it was, it was not mainstream. And this is 5-6 years ago. I mean, that's not that long ago in the, in the scheme of things. So yeah, it's very sudden. And most of the people that I've spoken to for all of these stories are otherwise vaccinated. Some of them don't like the flu shot. There's a little variety. Some of them have held off. They have different approaches to vaccinating their kids, but it's not as if like, oh, I've been onto this for 20 years and, because of something specific from my faith, it's kind of this swirling, some of it kind of intersects with some hippie stuff. Or just, skepticism of like Western modern medicine, that's common in other quarters too. And so, I think the resistance to the COVID vaccine, the sense I get is that it is actually less about it being a vaccine and more about it being in a line with closing down churches, with requiring masks, that it's like a piece of COVID regulations that they have already seen as a huge affront to privacy and, religious practice and lifestyle and freedom and all of that. So I think it's the connection to COVID restrictions. There are a few, Pentecostals and charismatics there is a little bit of a strain in those communities of skepticism to medicine, where it's almost like medicine, modern, Western medicine is like a little bit of a rival to those traditions that have a real strong emphasis on miraculous healing. So there's a little bit there, again, no formal, bans from on high against vaccination, but there's a little bit more of a strain there where there's just more hesitance in those communities to start with. But yeah, my answer is just that I think it's about COVID restrictions and less about vaccines per se.
Yeah,
Charlie.
I think, just to add a couple little things. I think, well, first of all, Kira Kiefer at Boston University is writing sort of a history of religious resistance to vaccines, a longer history. So I don't know when that will be up, but when she would know this, because there is a history to this. I don't know how how large these traditions are necessarily, but like Ruth said, it's not brand new. I would just say, the only thing I would add to that is just that I think a lot of it comes from Facebook and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. So same thing. I'm on Instagram, but not Facebook. And I feel like it's like a nice way to protest Facebook. And then I realized they're the same thing. Same guy. I think various types of conspiracies and disinformation and questioning of various sorts of authorities, like all of this stuff has always been swirling around different religious communities. And it's never been the case that you can go into, say, a church bookstore and find only doctrinaire theological texts that fit a coherent ideology, right? All of that stuff was always next to each other, but it's just so much easier online. So I really do think like part of the larger move toward vaccine skepticism, and especially toward the COVID vaccine skepticism, is just because if you like a certain page, you will get recommended other pages. You will get recommended other pages. If you watch certain YouTube videos, you'll get others, and they're swimming in circles that are coming together, and it's a soup.
Now, those are very insightful responses. I think certainly the role of social media, which has become even more important and influential in recent times, and also I think it's very compelling, Ruth. You're putting this within the context of other things, the shutdowns or lockdowns, and the mandates around not being able to have large gatherings and the requirements to wear masks, and then the vaccine for this particular virus within the context of those things. So very, very compelling and insightful elucidations. Charlie, I have a question for you. So you actually have done quite a bit of work on the subject of religious sincerity and have a book that's hitting the shelves soon from the University of Chicago Press. And so I'm wondering if you could explain why the subject of religious sincerity might not be so simple as it might at first seem. There is often the articulation of exemptions from vaccine requirements, either with a medical exemption or a sincerely held religious belief is the way that is often phrased. So why is this such a challenging topic?
I could say a lot about this, but I'll try to make it brief. The reason that sincerity is even a question at all, like why are we using this phrase sincerely held religious belief? This is my question why I started writing this book, which was actually right about when Hobby Lobby happened 7 years ago. I noticed this phrase everywhere. I was trying to figure out who cares about sincerity. And it comes from this 1944 case, the Ballard case, which is really interesting for a lot of reasons. But basically, there was a small religious group that had a series of beliefs that seemed outlandish, and they were arrested for mail fraud, for soliciting donations through the mails by saying things that weren't true. And so, to make a long story short, the Supreme Court decides this actually seems like a bad idea to say which religious beliefs are true and which aren't, right? Because is that really what the secular court wants to be doing, being the arbiter of religious truth? And so, which actually, I mean, they're right about that. That does seem like a bad idea. So what they do is they say, well, we can't say whether a belief is true or even whether it's like reasonable. What we can say is just, do you sincerely believe this? Like, is this really your individual sincere belief? And so what this does is a few things. One, it kind of removes people from sort of tests of doctrinaire accuracy even, and it kind of individualizes religious belief in a way that you don't even really have to believe what your church believes, what your denomination believes. It helps, obviously. You're more likely to win a case if you have a more quote unquote orthodox belief, if you don't seem weird. But you can be weird and you can believe crazy things that don't seem correct as long as you sincerely believe them. So that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. And actually, one of the things that I trace in the book, the middle chapters, a lot of this comes to a head in draft cases in the Selective Service, people, conscientious objectors to war, which is technically separate from free exercise, but it kind of gets grafted into it, so close enough. But what happens is the Congress says, you don't have to, the original law says if you're a member of a historic peace church, so the Quakers or the Mennonites or something, you don't have to fight in war. In 1940, they change it to say, by reason of your religious training and belief, whatever that is. So it sort of individualizes this. So there's all these different tests and cases, and it leads to this 1965 case, Seeger, where this guy, Dan Seeger, who is not religious, he's kind of hanging out with the Quakers, but he's not a Quaker yet. He was raised Catholic, but he's not Catholic anymore. He says, I've got a religious belief in an ethical creed, right? So the content of his belief is not religious or theological, but he holds it like a religious belief. And he wins his case. And so this sets up what's called the parallel belief test, which is the Supreme Court says, if the belief in question occupies a place parallel to that of a religious believer, that's good enough, right? So we're all these kind of individuals with these deeply held beliefs. Some of them are religious, some of them are not, but it's all basically religious if it's deeply held, sincerely felt, and so on. The language from that gets used in basically all these regulations, the EEOC guidelines, all kinds of, the religious exemptions to vaccine mandates. It's all using that language from that. So that's tricky for a lot of reasons, right? How do you determine who's sincere? How do you determine what's a religious belief and what's a kind of merely personal or political belief? And those are answered, frankly, kind of ad hoc, and that changes all the time. But the scope of what potentially could count is quite wide, as long as it's really important to you and you believe it as a sincere individual and you're not making it up.
Yeah, no, that is very helpful to hear, because your point about the shift from what a religious community or religious tradition has embraced or held in a small or orthodox sense is a significant difference from what an individual might embrace, regardless of whether they're part of a religious tradition that has been established in that way. Ruth, I'm wondering if you could chime in on this as well, since you've been covering a lot of different developments happening in contemporary religion and politics in America, and including cases where there are different debates around what counts for religious exemption. So how have you seen this question either answered or adjudicated, debated, or decided, particularly within the context of this pandemic?
Yeah, I love the fact that we get to have this conversation about sincerity, and like that's what it all hinges on, because that's at the center. I as a reporter, like, I'm more interested in, I love talking with the people who are who are holdouts. And I just was texting with the woman who was the lead of my piece about religious exemptions, and I was asking her, it's been a few months now, and I was wondering how she had I'll back up. Like, she's in Indiana. She works for like a mental health provider there, works with kids, but has been working largely from home during the pandemic. They're starting to come back in the office, and she is like she's a full blown holdout. And she filed a religious exemption. There was like a form her employer gave her. They denied her first, or they asked for more. They didn't deny it, but they asked for more information from her. And she eventually was able to get her pastor. She goes to like a local evangelical church, and was able to get him to kind of fill out this form for her and vouch for her that these are religious beliefs. And it was just like dragging out and out and out. And it still is. So they eventually came back to her and said, if you get regular testing, then fine, that can be the accommodation. She didn't believe in the testing. She believes that the nasal swabs have something carcinogenic in them. So that is not a religious belief, but the way that I'm probably not the one to say that, like some court should say that, but to me, the way that she talks about that particular piece of it is like that's just a scientific, belief that she has, or a non-scientific belief that she has. And so now they're going back and forth on some like alternate mode of testing that they'll approve, but she can't find the tests. And I mean, this is months, and she's working. And so, I mean, it's just like it's a little window into like how this actually plays out on the ground. But all that to say, I mean, she's a fascinating person to me, because she is a Christian, identifies as a Christian, would sort of say that that's like the primary lens through which she views the world. She's a regular churchgoer, but trying to untangle her beliefs about the vaccine from her politics, from her social media consumption, from like her like culture, her sort of cultural beliefs. And some of these, which I think the EEOC specifically says, like, well, these aren't religious, and like, this is what religion, this is what religion is, this is what it's not. Now the EEOC does say that religious objections, Charlie brought this up, and I love this, they can be uncommon, they can be new, they can seem illogical or unreasonable to others, which I always think that line has just a little bite to it. But it's in there, and it's so it doesn't, although she did get her pastor to kind of sign on with her, she didn't get these beliefs from her pastor. And so to me, it's almost like an exercise. It's absurd to try to disentangle those. So she wakes up in the middle of the night and has a Bible verse in her mind, encouraging her in her interpretation to, sort of participate in a protest where she stayed home from work one day. But yeah, I just think I don't want to throw my hands up and say no one can ever do anything about this, but I think it's an incredibly complex task. And it's that question of, what counts as religion, what counts as a religious exemption, is just, it's incredibly complicated, which makes it really fascinating for me as a reporter. But
well, just
I
to
add-
yes, yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
Just really briefly. Well, a fun fact, that language of the separating the religious from the other things,
yeah.
that's directly from Seeger, because it's directly from the 1948 Draft Act, which was the revision of the 41. And what they say there is, because the 1940 Act says religious training and belief, and then there's all these cases that are like, what is that? So Congress tries to rewrite it, not super helpfully, in 48, and they say, a religious training and belief comes from a belief in relation to a supreme being that is not essentially political, philosophical, sociological, or merely personal moral code, right? So then there's a couple more decades of cases about what the heck that means. But anyway, that language is like, that's just from the Draft Act.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so just to add even more complexity to this, I want to get some of your thinking about secularism. So Charlie, you're a scholar of American religion, which means you've actually devoted a lot of attention to secularism. So for the sake of queuing up this topic, let's just say someone were to claim that religion is getting special treatment with the examples you just used. If you have a sincerely held religious objection, then you can get an exemption. And someone, say a secularist, says, well, I as a secularist should be equally able to hold a sincere belief and receive an exemption from, and we're talking about public health requirements, it could be the draft or anything else, but in this case, public health requirements. So can you break down this hypothetical example? Is there, what's the difference between a religious reason and a secular reason? Or is there a difference, and how might that shed light on some of the things that we're seeing in public content and conflict today?
Yeah, I can go a few different directions with this. There's a lot to say, but first, I think it's important to disaggregate a little bit religious/secular beliefs from the content of those beliefs, right? Like when Ruth, when you're talking about the woman that you profiled, where she said, that the nasal swab is carcinogenic. That's not a religious belief, but it could be. But the question is, like, is it religious or not because of what it's about or how it's held, right? Is it believed religiously? Or is it, because like other cases, like the Hobby Lobby case, for example, the courts, I think this is one of the big problems actually in free exercise law, is that it's very, very easy to convince a court in the United States that a quote unquote conservative belief about sex and gender is religious, because we just know that's what religious beliefs are about, right? If like what Hobby Lobby, the corporation, believed was that it was killing a person to take a pill that would prevent a fertilized egg from attaching to the uterine wall. But nobody questioned on either side. Like, Ginsburg wrote this defense, but nowhere does she say this belief is not religious. And yet, it's not clear why. Like the religiosity of that doesn't really have to be defended in the way that it does for lots of other types of claims. We might say, why is that religious? So that's the one thing. It's like, what's the content here? So the other thing, so this question about the secularists. When I'm talking about secularism, I'm often talking about it as a system of government where, or an ideology. I mean, we could say a lot more about this, but the idea is that there is something that is religious and that there's something that is not. And good liberal secular governance is to regulate the line between these and do this properly, right? So in some ways, a secularist is somebody who wants to uphold this. But I think in the case, in the way that you're using it, it means a not religious person, right? A person who has some deeply held belief that is not religious or not theological. Maybe they have a political belief about the separation of church and state, something like that. What matters here is what gets called the neutrality principle, which I should say is a secularist principle in that sense. It's about how to do good secular governance. And that basically holds, it kind of comes from the 1940s and winds through, but it's still sort of in place. And the idea is basically that the government can't show favoritism toward religious groups over comparable secular groups, but it also can't make things worse on it either, right? It has to basically treat religion like it would treat any other comparable secular group. Now, the big question is, what's a comparable secular group, right? This came up in the Brooklyn Diocese versus Cuomo case from last year, where it was one of these mass gathering things in New York, and the Catholic Church, and they were joined by a synagogue. And they said, why are the grocery stores open but the churches aren't? And so this kind of debate breaks out among the court, where Gorsuch is saying this is discrimination against religion, and some of the liberal justices are saying actually religion is being treated more favorably because its real comparable institutions are sporting events, and those are closed, right? There's 0 people at a sporting event, there's 10 people in your church, so actually you're kind of getting a good deal. And Gorsuch just goes on this long thing about like bike shops. They're like, why can I go to a bike shop but I can't go to church, right? So the question is, what is a comparable activity? So in this hypothetical example, could a secularist get the same protections? Maybe, maybe not. I think it just depends on how they demonstrate the kind of depth of sincerity of their conviction. It also just depends like who's processing the claim and whether they're going to be sympathetic to them. It also depends if they have good legal representation, if they have some money, if they're, sympathetic to whatever person happens to be listening and overseeing their case, right?
Wow. Well, we're coming up on our Q&A. So for those of you in the audience, just again, inviting you to click that Q&A button, and you can send us your comments or questions, and our panelists will be happy to respond to those in just a moment. Before we go to those, I'm wondering if I can ask you both an even harder question. This is about the future. It does not involve lottery numbers. You can just text me those very, very discreetly if you happen to know those in the future. But this is more about the future of religion and society, given some of the things that have been happening. I'm wondering, if we can start with you, Ruth, what you see as being a trend or a set of trends that might develop in the future of religion and politics, and particularly given some of the things like the hardening of vaccine refusal in your own state of Texas or Florida, and some of the very complicated things that have been happening as well. So where is this pointing to? What kind of future are we looking at? No, understanding no one actually knows the future, but what are the trends?
No, I'm going to make a very concrete prediction that you can know. I'm not. Yeah. I mean, the thing that stands out to me about all of this that I think sort of shows the way this is going is how a third rail, can kind of develop so quickly, and something that, I'm thinking about Dan Darling's story that we were talking about before, where less than a year ago, he was secure in his religious community embracing the vaccine. a year later is fired for it. I mean, it's complicated, but essentially like the tide just shifted so quickly on that. For me as a reporter, it emphasizes yet again how like the real action, like what's really happening if you're interested in religion in America, is less and less about vaccines or less and less about vaccines, less and less about institutions, less and less about institutional voices. The annual meetings, although I'm going to one next week, are less and less kind of the beating heart of what's happening with, especially the most committed and passionate religious people in America, the people who are actually, putting, I don't know how to phrase this, but, making really sort of personally and politically consequential moves based on what they conceive of as their religious beliefs. That is less and less flowing downward from the big institutions that very recently would have been like, that's the kind of the easy way to, if you're interested in religion, that's what you look at as those institutions. So I don't know how this will crop up, like what issue will be the next thing that sort of becomes suddenly politicized. I am really curious about what it means for other vaccines. So, like I was saying, in sort of the kind of, Baptist evangelicalism that has traditionally not been opposed to most vaccines at all, I'm really curious, where those communities go when it comes to like school requirements for like the MMR shot. But other than that, it almost seems like it's something sort of hits the culture war cycle at the right time, and sort of anything can turn into a religious issue. So, yeah.
And you, Charlie, any thoughts about where these trends might lead in the near future?
I agree with all of what Ruth said, especially about I might like even push it a little bit further to say not just the way that religion gets politicized, but that political issues become actually part of the religion in a way. And I think that this kind of split between religion and politics, which has never been real and has always been kind of murky and tenuous, I think is, I was thinking about this today in the context of one of the standards for religious freedom law is the substantial burden test, where this is from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, where the government can the government can do things that violate your religious conscience and doesn't have to give you an accommodation unless it must create a substantial burden on your religious conscience, right? And so this kind of substantialness test has been, I mean, Hobby Lobby kind of messed it up weirdly because Alito said that the fine that Hobby Lobby would incur is a substantial burden. That's not what it means. It means like it has to be really central to your religious belief. And I've kind of wondered how much this is going to matter, because I mean, we've seen in a lot of cases that most people cave. Most people don't actually believe it that deeply or sincerely, or it's not a substantial part of being a Christian, right? You might say, I would prefer not to, this seems wrong. But if it comes down to it, like, you're going to a concert and they need a Vax card, like you're just going to get it, right? It's not a substantial burden. But I kind of wonder if, like, for some people, it does seem like being anti-vax is a substantial part of being a Christian. Supporting Trump could be a substantial part of being a Christian. And we shouldn't assume that these are kind of auxiliary issues or things that are being added to the religious faith, but actually constitutive of, in a really deep and central way, what it means to be religious for lots of people.
There's also, this is just a small thing to add on top of that, but largely because of social media, or at least social media accelerates this, that you have a community in resistance, right? So you choose not to go to the concert or lose your job, you will get a lot of reinforcement. And I don't want to minimize, I mean, losing your job is a big deal. And a lot of these things are really costly in a lot of material ways, but you also, I mean, I'm in these like Telegram groups of some of these people, and like, it's they're all encouraging each other. They're talking about this. I actually was down in at Dealey Plaza here in Dallas, where it's a slightly different cohort, but a big like QAnon gathering with, there's a lot of overlap with the anti-vaccine stuff. And, they were having a blast being together, right? So even the act of withholding some of those sort of benefits from yourself, there's a lot of sort of positive reinforcement in some of these communities for that. So
Yeah, and I
it
mean,
takes the
and not to,
motivations.
not to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think, a big part of religion is that community, right? And especially in these times when in-person gatherings haven't been able to occur at least as much. You think about what it means to be part of a church community or a religious community for a lot of people. It's, you have some sort of shared history, your families know each other, you go to the same place every week. What are the things that you hold in common? I think now one thing that a lot of people hold in common is you belong to the same anti-vax Facebook group, or, you have the same kind of, you all want to show up and wait for JFK Jr. to reappear or whatever. But there's, it's not just this kind of, and this is the weird thing about the sincerely held belief thing, is it's imagined by the law as this kind of radically individual thing, but it never is, right? These are always developed in community with others. And you can develop a real community around all kinds of stuff, and it doesn't have to be the Nicene Creed.
Don't talk bad about the Nicene Creed.
It worked for a long time. I'm just saying, JFK Jr. stuff might work too.
I'm in a great Nicene Creed Telegram group now.
So we have several questions from our audience, and one of those is about sincerity. And the question is, how does the makeup of the current population opposed to vaccination affect the notion of religious sincerity, and who's allowed to be seen as religiously sincere? So is there any relationship between the demographics of a given population and their legibility as holding sincerely held religious beliefs?
That's interesting. We were talking a little bit before this about, I think I'll let Charlie answer the legal part of it. But one interesting thing about all of this is that there's not some kind of like master authority who's deciding all that. A lot of it is being decided by like the HR person down the hall or at home, and right now maybe. And so, there's a lot of like kind of instinct work, I think, happening here when it really, as this is really playing out on the ground. So when I think about Chris Ann in Indiana, her first submission didn't work, and they were like, well, can you get some religious authority to fill out, this form? She could, but I interviewed a pastor in Iowa who was like handing out exemption forms. That he had kind of pre-written, and he would sign one for you, but he was drawing on like some 16th century like German resistance statement. And it's all like such a hodgepodge. I can't overestimate, or I can't overemphasize how it's like not an sort of organized thing at all. And that includes like who's making at least the initial judgments on what counts or not. So that's not a super clarifying, but I think that's like something that we haven't talked a lot about yet, is how at least the first line of decision makers on this, at all these like small employers especially it's really a lot of it will come down to kind of their first instinct. So I'm interested what Charlie has to say about kind of the legal piece of that though.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of better contemporary examples, but my mind keeps going back to the conscientious objectors. So I think I'll use that as kind of an example of the same sorts of dynamics that are still in play, which is the people with access to resources almost always do better, right? Because, and one of the strange things about sincerity is that it's supposed to be this kind of radically individual thing. You're not subject to tests of orthodoxy. And yet the people who are better at making their arguments win. And so I'm thinking about like I won't go into too much detail, but for the conscientious objectors, if you had a religious objection, you had to fill out this paperwork. And there were a series of questions about what's the nature of your religious belief? How long have you held it? And you could get people to write letters on your behalf, basically like letters of recommendation from a pastor or whoever. And then, Sylvester, you probably know this, there was an FBI investigation into every objector where they would talk to their school teachers and their associates and everybody that they knew and tried to determine this guy's sincerity. But then it would come before a local board, which was usually 3 veterans from the town who would look at, and the percentage of Black people on these boards is like 0.1, right? So Black people almost always lose because they just face this unsympathetic audience. They're read as primarily political because they have some involvement with the civil rights organization. And so they're not really a religious believer. They're just politically opposed to the Vietnam War, something like that, right? The people who win, people like Dan Seeger, there are these massive organizations to help them make their cases. There are these draft counselors. I spent weeks reading letters back and forth between these individual believers. They would fill out their paperwork and then they would send it to a draft counselor who worked at the American Friends Service Committee or somewhere like that. And they would say, yeah, don't use that word. That's not the right way to do it. Use this word. This is a good citation. Maybe you should cite Paul Tillich here, not this person, right? And they would kind of recraft it and then they would rewrite it and work back and forth. And that's how you win, right? And the same thing happens today with people like Liberty Counsel and ADF. They are helping you make your argument. So I think for a lot of these individuals who are just, some random person without kind of access to that or without access to a community, they just Google religious exemption and then they download some form. And I think those people won't be successful. The ones who will be successful are the main healthcare workers who have Liberty Counsel backing their lawsuit, or, the Daily Wire who has ADF backing it, and very, very good lawyers who have Federalist Society connections and stuff.
And there's a tier in between that too, because there are a lot of sort of consultant types who have various levels of expertise, but who have sort of hung out a shingle on this. And you can buy packages online for, $75, $100, different tiered packages for help crafting these letters. And, they'll suggest language, but also here's how to sort of tweak it according to your own tradition, your own sentiments. And so, there is kind of that mid-level too, where if you pay a little bit to help you craft it, but I don't think necessarily the people who, have the resources to do even that necessarily corresponds, with who is the most sincere, who kind of deserves it most. It just doesn't always correspond with that. It probably has to do with, resources and who has the motivation, I guess, but.
Yeah. Well, and who happens to be, like we were saying, who's processing the claim, right?
Yeah,
you might just luck out and have somebody who is sympathetic or who doesn't want to deal with it and is just being on the safe side and giving everything the stamp of approval and moving it along, doesn't want to get sued. Or you might face somebody who, especially in these small towns, I think about like what happens at a local clinic, right? They have 20 employees and 2 of them file a religious exemption signed by a pastor that everybody in town knows. And the one person who works in HR has to decide, like, who knows? And maybe they're friends, maybe they hate each other. Like, that's probably what's going to determine it, right?
So we have another question from our audience, and this one asks, are there connections between COVID vaccines refusal and the anti-vax movements related to the spurious MMR autism debate?
Yes, in that all of those things are kind of swirling around online together. I mean, there's a whole lot of, it's funny, when I was reporting that abortion vaccine resistance story 5 years ago, there were a lot of people who would talk about the abortion concerns, but then it also turned out that they had these, these health concerns and these autism concerns. And didn't want their kids to get vaccinated all at once. That's kind of like the entryway to anti-vax stuff, and or it can be. So yeah, yes, there is like not necessarily an ideological connection that I can make terribly coherently, but there's a lot of overlap. I mean, the abortion thing is interesting to me because of how many people hadn't heard of it a few years ago, now have, and then yeah, how does that carry forward? Is that a new belief that influences other things? I mean, they sort of pass back and forth almost as beliefs, these sort of moral and medical objections swirling together, but it's in the same individuals in a lot of cases, and it would be hard to trace back what's the kind of starting objection. But yeah, a lot of people in California who I've interviewed about this. I mean, really, like it is interesting how people kind of in those hotbeds of not necessarily religious vaccine objections have now emerged with these other concerns. So
yeah, I haven't really studied it, so I don't have much to add to that, except to say that I think it just depends what you're reading and where you're getting your information. And I do think that it just depends who we're looking at, I think, and it's so idiosyncratic and individual. I think most people have a more coherent ideology than it might at first seem. But it's hard to generalize. You got to drill down and figure out like, okay, what is the link between like this granola stuff and your Pentecostalism and your fitness routine? Like there is something actually, but it's kind of different for everybody. And I mean, more and more it's just determined by an algorithm, but that's not entirely the case either. There's there's a lot of overlap, but we would just have to look. You could do a kind of macro version and see like what pages people are looking at and you could do like the sort of big study of it. But I think the better way to get at it is more fine-grained and ethnographically, which is work that I haven't done, but I hope other people are.
So we have another question. Now, this one's related to the previous one, and it asks, does vaccine skepticism map onto broad-scale skepticism towards public goods generally? So is private liberty threatened in this world by public health?
can you say that one more time?
Sure. The question asks, does vaccine skepticism map onto a more general form of skepticism toward public good?
Okay.
So for example, is private liberty threatened in this world by public health? So is this is it perhaps the case that what we're seeing is a specific instance of a broader phenomenon where private liberty is placed at odds with public good?
Yeah, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to let Charlie go first.
I'll take a quick stab at it. I would kind of like to hear a little bit. If I know, Sylvester, you're just moderating, but I'm speaking honestly, as one of my very favorite theorists of freedom, I think you would have a lot of good stuff to say about this. But I think that an answer to this question would have to contend with what the dominant ideologies of freedom are in the United States and how radically individual many people conceptualize freedom to be, and how I think the predominant understanding of liberty, especially among people on the right, but not just on the right, is one of negative liberty, right? The freedom from coercion, government intervention, and not the freedom to, not this positive liberty, have more full lives, to be in community with each other. And so, I think we've seen this very, very starkly in the pandemic in ways that I found, what's the nice word for it? Like crazy making, driving me nuts. And also just like incredibly sad, frankly. The idea that your individual liberty might be slightly sacrificed in the service of the liberty of our community to not get sick and die, to be healthy, to thrive, right? Almost doesn't make sense conceptually to a lot of people, right? Because liberty is that second kind of freedom isn't really freedom. It's something else. It's the public good maybe, but I think a lot of people just don't have a conception of the public good. There is no public, there is no society, right? This is a kind of neoliberal age we live in, whatever. And so honestly, I think that's one of the biggest problems. And I don't think that conception of individual negative freedom is separate from conservative theology. In fact, I think it is perhaps indebted to it. Maybe that comes first, this sort of revivalist individual conception of the human as free. And so when we run into situations where my exercise of liberty imposes on yours, it's almost hard to conceive of this in the sort of like popular American political philosophy, especially on the right, but again, not just on the right.
Yeah, I think when I think about religious conservatives, the core unit for a lot of people is the individual, and then also like the nuclear family. And that's, anything that would violate that. So there's a lot of overlap here with like homeschooling. And I do think that there's a reason for that, right? So sort of skepticism of public institutions that might, and you can see all this backlash to public schools now. Some of that, this is other reporting that I've done, but parents saying like, well, now I've been seeing on Zoom what my kids are learning in public schools and I don't like it. And so that's sort of like the core thing that cannot be violated is the family and the sort of the freedom to run your family as you want. So you see that backlash to Terry McAuliffe saying that parents shouldn't be responsible for what their kids learn in school, and then he loses. So I don't know, that's the small thing that I would have to add on to that, where I don't think that in a lot of these circles you have a sense of like the public good certainly not being higher than the individual and family level.
So we have about 10 minutes remaining, and at least a couple of more questions from the audience here. One of those is asking, are there examples of governmental attitudes or policies toward religious conviction that seem to work? Again, are there examples of government attitudes or government policies toward religious conviction that seem to work? And then a follow-up is, can those policies work at both the communal level and also at individual levels? So this intersects with something, Charlie, you were getting at earlier with this sense of individual versus collective good, or individual versus collective freedom. But does either of you have thoughts about examples of government policies that seem to work with this notion of religious conviction?
You mean that are like effective at sort of combating some of this resistance? Is that the idea?
Yes, both at combating the resistance and also that seem to make space for both individual and collectives.
That's a really good question. I can't think of any off the top of my head, which is really depressing.
Yeah, that probably says something. I can't either.
Yeah, these are very difficult challenges. And if anyone in the audience does have an example of what they think might be a workable paradigm, you could certainly share that in the Q&A for our panelists to look at. We have another question then. So can the panelists, so can each of you speak more on what is meant by religion and, quote, undue hardship, and what that means for employers? So this gets at some of the juridical analysis of these issues that was being discussed earlier. So what does undue hardship mean, particularly within the context of employers? So of course, particular case in mind that broached this was the Hobby Lobby Supreme Court ruling in 2014.
Yeah, well, I want to preface my answer by saying I'm not a lawyer yet. We'll see. See how things work out. But there actually is a really important difference between, specifically on this issue of burdens, between how governmental actions are handled and how the actions of private employers are handled. And so, again, I'm not an expert in this. Somebody in religious studies who is working on this, though, is Isaac Weiner. So he's look for he has a piece in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and then he's got some stuff coming out about workplace accommodations. But it's actually quite different because the burden in question is on different parties here. So in a case where the government is doing something, has some regulation that imposes on an individual's religious conscience or religious liberty, the burden there is to prove that the individual's belief is substantially burdened. And then if it is, the government has to accommodate it unless there's just no workaround, right? Unless this is the least restrictive means clause, right? Unless, say, like, the government just has to do something, it's required, it's for public health, for whatever, and there's just no way to get around violating your conscience, then they can do it, but only then, if it's a substantial burden on you. For a private employer, all they have to demonstrate is that there's a minimal burden on them, and then they don't have to accommodate you. So, and that's one of the differences between like free exercise law with the First Amendment and governing like governmental actions, and statutory law with Title VII and the EEOC. That's a lot more friendly to the employers. So one thing I've noticed about this, I have a friend who just sent me yesterday. She works at a state university in the Midwest, and their president of the university sent out something about not requiring vaccines and so on. But it was really interesting to me because the way that it was written was as an employer, not as a government entity, right? And of course it's both, right? But if you take the state's, if a state university does something and you treat it as a governmental action, there's a totally different standard than if you treat it as an employer doing something. And employers have quite a lot of rights in the US to do things to people that the government is not allowed to do. So that's a tricky thing to kind of look out for, I think, especially we'll see this in public schools too, with like, if there's issues with teachers, public health organizations, are they acting like employers or are they acting like the government? And that's going to trigger a different set of concerns about what the burden is and whom the burden is on, and so on.
Does it make a difference? Now I'm just piling on with a question of my own, but I mean, I'm really struck by how the mandatory vaccine system was kind of humming along as long as it was like, 1% of a population holds out, and it's based on, what they profess as a religion, and it's fine. Like, it hums along because 99% are on board. And I wonder how that undue hardship question changes if you're getting to a critical mass where suddenly, okay, now it is like a bigger like health burden and like a health risk. But I don't know how the law, you can't be like, well, it's sincerely, it's perfectly fine to hold this religious belief as long as you're like part of a population that's X% or smaller. I mean, there's just no way it's going to work out that way. But I'm just curious how that population balance just throws such a wrench in some of these principles.
Yeah, that's, it would maybe change the nature of the government's compelling interest, right? The government has a compelling interest to have 90% of people vaccinated, but it doesn't necessarily have a more compelling interest in having 99% of people. Right. So maybe it matters there. Although this just came up in that Maine health workers case that the Supreme Court decided not to review it. And then actually just like earlier this afternoon, the claimant sent it back to the court. So we'll see what happens, whatever. But But 3 justices said they should take it up, and Gorsuch wrote the dissent. And Gorsuch said, the state of Maine hasn't actually demonstrated that they need everybody to be vaccinated. They haven't been given a good enough reason. And to speak to this issue of like, what's a secular objection versus a religious one, they're allowing medical exemptions, but not allowing religious exemptions. And what he says is, if you're unvaccinated for a religious reason, or if you're unvaccinated for a medical reason, you still pose the same risks to other people and yourself. So whatever the government's interest is in, then like has to apply equally. This is probably a bad argument, but that's the one he's making, and that's the one that Liberty Counsel is kind of hanging on as they reintroduce the case. So
that's interesting. It's sort of, I mean, it reminds me of some of the conversations around like exceptions for rape and incest and abortion law. Well, if you believe that that's a that fetus is a human life that's being killed, then it's not actually like morally relevant how it came into creation. So yeah, that's an interesting argument.
Well, we are at our time, so I want to thank both of you again, Ruth Graham and Charlie McCrary, for joining us in this discussion about religion and vaccine exemptions and the larger issue of vaccine refusal. It's been very enlightening to have you work through some of the complexities of this issue. And I want to thank Matthew Gabrielle for introducing us and for organizing this event. And also Dominique Francesca, who is the business manager for the Center for Humanities, has been behind the scenes here, making sure that all of the webinar and our live stream to YouTube goes well. So thanks very much, Dominique. To our audience, thank you for joining us as well for this conversation and for your comments and questions that you share through in the Q&A. So we wish you a good evening, and hope you'll join us again for some of the upcoming programming that we have at Virginia Tech. So thanks both of you very much.
Thank you.
thank you.